In this section, we're going to learn about warp knit types. Warp knitting is a more modern evolution of our knit fabric. Warp knitting is a different style of knitting where columns of loops are made by zigzagging the yarn along the length of the fabric. This means the yarns form a column of wales instead of a column of courses. So a column of loops is made, or a wale of loops is made, before a course is made. The courses are made by stacking the wales side by side or interlocking them. Warp knitting is almost exclusively done by machine instead of by hand. Warp knitting. Warp knits are made in a way that is a bit similar to woven fabric in that the yarns are supplied in the warp direction first. Warp knits are resistant to unraveling, are flatter than other knits, and have less stretch to them. In some variations, they have stretch in only one direction instead of in all directions, like typical knit fabrics. Because warp knits are less stretchy than weft knits, spandex is often used in the fiber content for the yarns to add back a bit of that stretch. Our first type of warp knit is tricot. Tricot is one of the most popular types of warp knit, and it interlaces another set of yarns through the warp knit structure, as we can see it here zigzagging through the fabric. Tricot fabric has a fine lengthwise ribs running through the face of the fabric, and the wrong side has fine crosswise ribs. Tricot is often used in lingerie and has better draping qualities than regular weft knits. Tricot can come in many different varieties, such as plain, shown on the left, loop raised, corded, ribbed, or velour. Here are some of the different tricot variations. Here we have a plain tricot, and you can see those fine diagonal ribbings. It looks a bit like a twill weave, but if it stretches, it's probably a tricot. Now, of course, some twill weaves have spandex in it, so if it does stretch, you'll have to look a little bit closer. Here is a ribbed tricot. It's very characteristic of the ribs that run through it. And here we have a raised loop tricot. And we'll talk a little bit more about loop tricots later. Even more than those, there are many different tricot variations. Here we can see the typical tricot, a lock knit tricot, a reverse lock knit, a 3 or 4 needle satin tricot, and a 3 or 4 needle shark skin tricot. As you can see, very many variations. But all have the same relatively similar properties. The Rachel knit. Named after the French actress Elizabeth Felice Rachel, or Rachel. It's not a very French way of pronouncing it. But they're named after her. I don't know where the S came in. Came in sometime after, I guess. We pronounce it Rachel knits. And they are a special type of warp knit made on a Rachel machine. So a special machine made especially for this type of knit. The Rachel knits provide lacy fabrics that can be stretchy or fairly stable. Lace made in traditional methods are very expensive, but Rachel knits offered a relatively inexpensive way to make knits, and most commercial knits are now a form of Rachel knit. Rachel knits often use different weight yarns to add texture to their patterning, so it may feel like it has a raised texture to the design. Now you might be wondering, well, how do I tell the difference between a Rachel knit and a lace knit? they look pretty similar, or can look very similar. Indeed, they can. Our traditional lace knit uses the weft style of construction. Our Rachel knit uses the warp style. It can be very difficult to tell the difference, but as we look in, the Rachel knits will look more like what we're used to seeing in a traditional knit. It'll have more open spaces and will have less of the knit stitch shape seen in its face or wrong side. Here's another example of Rachel knit. As you can see in the close-up, we get these very fine, intricate patterns, but nothing closely resembles that V-shaped structure we're used to seeing in knit fabrics. In fact, it just looks like a nice mesh with some lacy textures over top of it. Rachel knits do tend to have stretch. Some can have very little stretch, but most will have some amount of stretch to them. Next, we're going to move on to specialty knits. And these are special types of knits that don't fall in the common knit variety of either our weft knit or our warp knit. And some can be used using both techniques. Velour. So velour is a type of piled knit. We talked in tricots about a looped pile, and this is a somewhat similar construction method. It resembles velvet, and often the two are confused. The difference between velour and velvet is that velvet is a woven fabric, where velour is knit. This means most velvets do not stretch, where velour always stretches. Many people think the difference between velvet and velour is that velvet is made with silk and velour is made with synthetic fiber. However, both types of fabric can be made with any type of natural or synthetic fiber. The difference is in the construction. The inherent stretch of these knits gives velour a wonderfully comfy loungewear, conducive, and also very good for dancewear. Here are some examples of velour. Again, we see that soft, plushy pile on top of the velour fabric. Another way to tell velour and velvet apart is that the pile on velour tends to be smaller than the velour on velvet. Jacquard knits. Jacquard knits is a catch-all term for any complex, multicolored pattern for knit fabrics. Just like the jacquard loom opened up the world for complex designs to the woven fabrics, for complex designs to be woven directly into a piece of fabric, the jacquard knitting machine also allows millers to knit in complex, multicolored designs easily. Jacquard knits are machine knit, but can be used to make knit patterns that are traditionally made by hand, like Fair Isle and Argyle. In fact, most commercially produced Fair Isles today are made using a jacquard knitting machine. Here are some examples of fabric made with the jacquard knit. As you can see, it's capable of any type of large or complex patterning. Next we have a terry knit, or a French terry. So terry knits are fabrics with the characteristic of a looped pile. Now we talked about terry cloth in our woven section, as there are versions of terry cloth that are made using a weaving technique. However, a similar fabric is also made called a terry knit. In both cases, they have the characteristic looped pile sticking out from one or both sides of the fabric. How do I tell the difference between a terry knit and a terry cloth, which is woven? Well, you can't do it by the presence of loops because they both have them. But, like in many situations, the terry knit will stretch, and for the most part, terry cloths do not. It is very unusual to have spandex added to a woven terry cloth, as it would reduce its absorbent properties. So most of the time when we see woven terry cloth, it will not stretch. So the stretch test works pretty good when telling the difference between a terry knit and a terry cloth. Terry knits are a variation of tricot warp knit that uses two different size needles to create the little looped pile. So they use a bigger loop and add in an extra loop on that bigger needle to create the little loop. This is an interesting use of two different needle sizes and the effects that it can result from it. French terry is a type of terry knit with a looped pile on one side and a soft, smooth, plush side. Most terry knits that we see commercially available are French terries. This is because French terry is incredibly popular for sweatshirts, hoodies, and sweatpants. This is because the stretch makes them extra comfy and nice to wear, easy to wear, and like all terry cloth, they are highly absorbent. This is a picture of terry cloth on the outside and the inside. The outside will look like our normal sort of knit, maybe a little bit different again because it's typically a tricot knit, although it doesn't need to be. But we'll see our little V's, our little knit stitches that we're used to seeing in some form or another, and on the inside we will see the loops popping out of the back. Often French terry will have two distinct colors, a lighter side for the looped inside and a darker side for the face or outside of the fabric. This is because the yarn that is used to loop is typically a different set of yarns than the main composition of the fabric. Next we have fleece knit. So fleece knit is also a piled knit. It's a soft, thick, plushy fabric with kind of a pebbly, fluffy nap. The fleece knit is made in a similar way to the terry knits, but what we do with the raised pile is we cut it and brush it to create a matted, fluffy surface to the fabric. This fluffy texture will obscure the actual knit stitches used to make the fabric, and all you can really see is that fuzzy outside of the fabric. Fleece knits are used for warmth and are very popular in sweaters used for outdoor activities. Many brands like Patagonia, who likes to claim the first company to originate the fleece, create their own types of fleece knit that are their own patented creations. Sometimes fleece knit is also called polar fleece. Here is the classic Patagonia fleece. Again, they are claiming to be the first ones to invent the fleece fabric and create garments like this, which are very good for keeping people warm outside. Now, fleece fabrics are typically made from synthetic fibers. Here's a close-up of that little pebbly, plushy pile created by the fleece knit technique. Pointelle knit. Pointelle knits are made by using a jacquard knitting machine, as they are more complex than their relatively simple appearance looks like. They use a technique of not fully forming a loop in one of the courses, which creates a hole in the fabric. Pointelle knits are usually light in weight and feature small stabilized holes arranged in patterns throughout the fabric. Here we can see, looks pretty much like your standard knit, and then we have these tiny little points or holes in the fabric. Here are some more examples of pointelle knit. Now, a true pointelle knit, the holes will always be very, very small, subtle holes that are kind of a little bit oval-shaped points, hence the name pointelle. It is often confused with lace knits. I think it's because pointelle sounds kind of fun and fancy. And I've seen lots of garments that claim that they are pointelle, but really are lace knits. The two really can be interchangeable, but if you have large and differently shaped holes, not just small little points, it's probably a lace knit. Or if it looks exactly like a lace, it's probably a Rochelle knit. If they're small, tiny holes like this, usually in either a singular or diamond-shaped pattern or in stripes, tiny, small holes that only span the width of one stitch, then it's a pointelle. Next we have thermal knit. Thermal knits are knits that use a weft knit construction but arrange knit and purl stitches to create this overall texture. Thermal knits are also called waffle knits because their texture resembles a waffle. So we have a sort of depression and surrounding raised texture, and the depressions are sort of evenly staggered throughout. This texture is known for its insulating property and is used in garments and products where warmth is needed. Here are a couple other examples of our waffle knit, and the texture again can be very subtle, like in this picture over here. I had to zoom in pretty close before you could even start to see the waffling texture, and this is because it was made using quite fine yarns. However, the thicker the yarn, the more pronounced the texture will be. In this little printed fabric, the yarns are slightly thicker, so we're getting a more noticeable waffling. This ends our section on knit fabrics. I hope you learned something. Knits are incredibly versatile, and they are gaining in popularity in home wardrobes everywhere. Really new modern advancements in knitting machines have taken knitting into the mainstream, and their versatility along with their inherent stretch has really provided for their sort of universal success throughout the industry. And really, knits were fairly late to be commercially produced. They were sort of a niche fabric until, probably the mid-1900s, when they really started becoming more and more adopted for more and more garments, and not just for sportswear or activities where the stretch was needed. And new synthetic fibers, as well as new knitting techniques, are continuing the trend of giving us all types of knit fabrics. Maybe you've been inspired to try to take up some knitting yourself. Well, knitting is a great, cheap hobby to get into, so I fully condone it. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.